In the sweltering heat of El Paso, Texas, a different kind of monster was born, one whose psychology would be shaped not by cold calculation, but by chaos, violence, and a twisted fascination with darkness that would terrorize California for over a year. Tonight, we delve into the mind of Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, exploring how childhood trauma, family dysfunction, and exposure to extreme violence created a predator whose crimes defied all logical patterns. Before we begin this journey into one of criminal psychology's most disturbing cases, I'd love to know, put in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. There's something particularly fitting about exploring the Night Stalker's psychology during the darker hours when he preferred to hunt. If you find value in these comprehensive psychological analyses, subscribing helps us continue examining the most complex criminal minds in history. Tonight's exploration will take us through Richard Ramirez's transformation from troubled child to satanic serial killer, examining how exposure to violence, substance abuse, and psychological manipulation created a predator whose random brutality would challenge everything we thought we knew about criminal behavior patterns. Richard Leyva Ramirez was born February 29, 1960, into a working-class Mexican-American family in El Paso, Texas. The leap-year birth would later fuel his belief in supernatural significance and destiny, contributing to the grandiose delusions that would characterize his criminal psychology. The Ramirez household was marked by poverty, instability, and violence from Richard's earliest memories. His father, Julian Ramirez, was a laborer who struggled with alcoholism and explosive anger, creating an atmosphere of unpredictability and fear that would profoundly shape Richard's developing psyche. Mercedes Ramirez, Richard's mother, worked in a shoe factory while trying to manage 5 children in an increasingly chaotic household. Her inability to protect Richard from the violence around him contributed to his early understanding that the world was fundamentally unsafe and unpredictable. The family's economic struggles created additional stress that manifested in domestic violence, substance abuse, and emotional neglect. Richard learned early that survival required hypervigilance, that violence was normal, and that traditional authority figures offered no protection or stability. Richard's exposure to his father's violent temper created his first understanding of power dynamics and the use of fear as a control mechanism. Julian's unpredictable rages taught Richard that violence was an acceptable response to frustration and that intimidation could be used to achieve compliance. The religious environment of the Ramirez household was complex and contradictory, combining traditional Catholicism with superstitious beliefs and folk practices. This religious confusion would later contribute to Richard's fascination with Satanism as a rejection of his childhood's spiritual framework. Richard's early head injuries began accumulating during his toddler years, including a severe fall from a dresser that required medical attention. These repeated cranial traumas would affect his neurological development and contribute to the impulsivity and rage that characterized his later behavior. His school performance was consistently poor, not due to lack of intelligence, but because of attention problems, behavioral issues, and the chaotic home environment that prevented consistent academic engagement. Teachers noted his withdrawal and occasional explosive anger episodes. Richard's relationship with his older brother Robert was complicated by jealousy and competition for parental attention in a household where positive reinforcement was scarce. Robert's apparent success in staying out of trouble created additional pressure and resentment for Richard. The introduction of his cousin Miguel Ramirez into Richard's life would prove to be the most psychologically destructive influence of his childhood. Miguel, a Vietnam War veteran, returned from combat with severe PTSD and a collection of disturbing war photographs that would profoundly impact Richard's developing psychology. Miguel's war stories combined with graphic photographs of torture, rape, and murder provided Richard with his first systematic exposure to extreme violence as entertainment. These images and narratives began normalizing brutality and associating violence with excitement and power. The psychological bond that developed between Richard and Miguel was based on shared exposure to violence and Miguel's grooming of Richard to accept and even celebrate brutality. Miguel became the male role model that Richard's father had failed to provide, but this mentorship was profoundly corrupted. Richard's first direct exposure to murder occurred when he witnessed Miguel kill his wife during a domestic dispute. Rather than traumatizing Richard in a traditional sense, this event validated Miguel's teachings about violence and power, demonstrating that killing was achievable and that the strong could dominate the weak. The psychological impact of witnessing this murder was compounded by Miguel's subsequent behavior, his lack of remorse, his casual attitude toward having killed, and his continued presence in Richard's life despite having committed murder. This normalized killing as a problem-solving technique. Richard's relationship with his own sexuality began developing within this context of violence and power dynamics. His early sexual experiences were influenced by Miguel's stories and photographs, creating associations between sexuality and violence that would profoundly shape his future criminal behavior. The family's response to Miguel's crime, treating it as a tragic but understandable result of his war trauma, taught Richard that violence could be excused and that perpetrators could maintain family relationships despite their actions. This undermined any natural inhibitions against violence. Richard's early experimentation with petty crime began during his elementary school years, starting with theft and vandalism. These activities provided him with feelings of power and control that were absent from other areas of his life, creating positive associations with criminal behavior. His fascination with death and violence became increasingly apparent to family members and teachers, but the adults in his life lacked the knowledge or resources to address these warning signs effectively. His disturbing interests were dismissed as normal boyhood curiosity or blamed on his association with Miguel. Richard's first exposure to pornography occurred through Miguel's collection, which included violent and degrading material that further associated sexuality with dominance and brutality. This early conditioning would influence his victim selection and assault patterns in his later crimes. The social isolation that characterized Richard's adolescence was both chosen and imposed. He withdrew from normal peer relationships while being rejected by classmates who found his interests and behavior disturbing. This isolation reinforced his developing antisocial tendencies. Richard's academic failure was not addressed with appropriate intervention, allowing his educational deficits to compound and limiting his legitimate opportunities for success and social integration. School became another arena where he experienced failure and rejection. His early experimentation with drugs began with inhalants and marijuana, progressing to more serious substances as he sought chemical solutions to his psychological pain and social inadequacy. Substance abuse became both escape mechanism and disinhibitor for his violent impulses. The family's financial instability meant frequent moves within the El Paso area, preventing Richard from developing stable relationships or consistent social connections. This nomadic lifestyle reinforced his sense of rootlessness and alienation from conventional social structures. Richard's relationship with organized religion became increasingly antagonistic as he associated Catholic teachings with the hypocrisy and violence he observed in his family life. His rejection of Christianity would later manifest as attraction to Satanism and occult practices. His early sexual experiences were characterized by aggression and a need for dominance, reflecting the influence of Miguel's teachings and the violent sexual imagery he had been exposed to throughout his development. Normal intimacy patterns never developed. The psychological foundation for Richard's future crimes was established by age 15. He had learned that violence was normal and acceptable, that power came through intimidation and brutality, that traditional morality was hypocritical, and that his own needs justified any means of satisfying them. Richard's exposure to drugs escalated during his mid-teens, with PCP becoming his preferred substance. This drug's effects on impulse control and reality perception would later contribute to the chaotic and seemingly random nature of his criminal behavior. The family's awareness of Richard's disturbing psychological development was hindered by their own dysfunction and lack of resources. Warning signs were ignored or minimized, allowing his antisocial tendencies to develop without intervention or treatment. Richard's first arrest occurred during his teenage years for marijuana possession, introducing him to the criminal justice system and reinforcing his identity as an outsider and rule breaker. This contact with law enforcement confirmed his adversarial relationship with authority. His high school years were marked by increasing truancy, substance abuse, and involvement in petty crime. Academic failure and social rejection pushed him further toward criminal associates and antisocial activities, creating a trajectory toward more serious offending. The geographical influence of growing up near the Mexican border exposed Richard to additional criminal opportunities and networks, while the cultural dynamics of the border region contributed to his complex relationship with identity, belonging, and social marginality. Richard's late adolescent years were characterized by increasing violence in his criminal activities, escalating from property crimes to assaults as his need for power and control grew more intense and his inhibitions weakened through substance abuse and social alienation. The psychological transformation from troubled teenager to potential serial killer was accelerating by Richard's late teens, as the combination of childhood trauma, violent conditioning, substance abuse, and social failure created the perfect conditions for the emergence of a predator whose random brutality would terrorize an entire region. His move to California in his early 20s would provide him with the anonymity, opportunities, and urban hunting grounds necessary to begin the killing spree that would earn him infamy as one of America's most feared serial killers, demonstrating how childhood psychological damage can metastasize into societal terror when left untreated and unaddressed. Richard Ramirez's transition from troubled teenager to active predator represents one of criminal psychology's most dramatic transformations, characterized not by the gradual escalation seen in most serial killers, but by a rapid psychological deterioration fueled by heavy drug use, occult obsessions, and an increasingly grandiose sense of his own dark destiny. Richard's move to California in the early 1980s marked the beginning of his psychological metamorphosis from petty criminal to serial killer. The anonymity of Los Angeles, combined with the area's vast urban sprawl and diverse population, provided him with the perfect environment for his criminal evolution. His immersion in the Los Angeles drug culture introduced Richard to criminal networks and lifestyle patterns that would facilitate his transformation into a predator. The availability of high-quality drugs, particularly cocaine and PCP, accelerated his psychological deterioration while providing him with the connections necessary for sustained criminal activity. The psychological impact of sustained drug abuse on Richard's already damaged psyche cannot be overstated. PCP, his preferred substance, is known for causing paranoia, delusions, and extreme violence effects that interacted catastrophically with his existing antisocial tendencies and violent conditioning. Richard's discovery of heavy metal music and occult imagery provided him with a cultural framework for his violent fantasies and antisocial impulses. Bands like AC or DC became psychological triggers that reinforced his growing identification with darkness, rebellion, and supernatural power. His fascination with Satanism wasn't simply teenage rebellion, but rather a sophisticated psychological system that justified his violent impulses while providing him with a sense of purpose and destiny. Satan worship gave meaning to his antisocial tendencies and transformed his criminal desires into religious obligations. The development of Richard's distinctive appearance during this period was a crucial aspect of his psychological evolution. His all-black clothing, long hair, and eventual dental deterioration from drug use created an intimidating presence that both reflected and reinforced his internal transformation. Richard's criminal activity during his early California years involved burglary and theft, crimes that taught him valuable skills in surveillance, entry techniques, and victim assessment, while providing him with the financial resources necessary to maintain his drug addiction and lifestyle. The psychological satisfaction Richard derived from breaking into homes represented more than simple theft. These violations gave him a sense of power over his victims and their private spaces. The intimate nature of home invasion fed his need for dominance and control over others. His ability to move through neighborhoods undetected while under the influence of drugs demonstrates the functional aspects of his addiction. Substances that might incapacitate others actually enhanced his criminal capabilities by reducing his inhibitions and increasing his boldness. Richard's victim observation patterns during his burglary phase reveal the developing psychology of a predator. He wasn't simply looking for valuable items but was unconsciously studying potential victims, learning their routines, and developing the skills necessary for more serious crimes. The escalation from property crime to violent crime was gradual but inevitable, driven by Richard's increasing need for psychological stimulation and his growing confidence in his criminal abilities. Theft alone could no longer provide the psychological satisfaction he craved. His first violent crimes involved assault during the course of burglaries, as Richard discovered that the terror and submission of victims provided him with psychological rewards that far exceeded the monetary value of stolen property. Violence became its own motivation. The psychological impact of successfully committing violent crimes created an addiction to the power and control that physical dominance provided. Richard learned that he could achieve ultimate psychological satisfaction through the complete subjugation of helpless victims. His development of signature behaviors during this period reveals the systematic nature of his psychological evolution. Specific techniques for victim control, particular types of violence, and ritualistic elements begin appearing consistently across his crimes. Richard's relationship with firearms developed during this criminal apprenticeship, as he learned to use weapons not just as tools for intimidation but as instruments of ultimate power. His gun usage reflected his need for psychological dominance rather than practical efficiency. The geographical expansion of his criminal territory demonstrates Richard's growing confidence and his increasing need for fresh hunting grounds. As he exhausted opportunities in familiar areas, he expanded his operational range while maintaining the mobility necessary to avoid detection. His psychological preparation for murder involved extensive fantasy development and mental rehearsal, similar to other serial killers but characterized by the chaotic and drug-influenced nature of his thought processes. His murder fantasies were less organized but more immediately intense. Richard's first murder marked a psychological point of no return, providing him with the ultimate expression of power and control while demonstrating that he could cross the final taboo without psychological breakdown or immediate consequences. The psychological high Richard experienced from killing created an immediate addiction that drugs alone could not satisfy. Murder became the only activity capable of providing adequate psychological stimulation and satisfaction for his increasingly demanding psyche. His post-murder behavior reveals the disinhibiting effects of crossing the killing threshold. Once he had committed murder, all other forms of violence became psychologically accessible and emotionally acceptable. The final barrier to unlimited brutality had been removed. Richard's developing sense of supernatural protection and destiny was reinforced by his early success in avoiding capture. He interpreted his ability to commit crimes without immediate consequences as evidence of demonic favor and protection. The psychological compartmentalization required to maintain any semblance of normal functioning while committing increasingly violent crimes was achieved through heavy drug use, which allowed Richard to dissociate from the reality of his actions while maintaining operational effectiveness. His victim selection during this evolutionary phase was initially opportunistic, but gradually became more sophisticated as he learned to identify optimal targets and situations. His criteria evolved from simple availability to complex assessments of vulnerability and risk. Richard's development of entry techniques and victim control methods reveals the practical learning that accompanied his psychological evolution. Each crime provided him with operational intelligence that improved his effectiveness in subsequent attacks. The escalation in violence during his attacks reflects both his increasing psychological needs and his growing confidence in his ability to control victims and crime scenes. What began as simple assault evolved into elaborate torture and killing scenarios. His psychological relationship with his weapons became increasingly fetishistic, as guns and knives represented not just tools but symbols of his power and extensions of his violent identity. Weapon selection became an important aspect of his criminal ritual. Richard's growing paranoia, fueled by drug use and criminal activity, created a psychological state where violence seemed like the only rational response to perceived threats. His reality testing became severely compromised, making him increasingly dangerous and unpredictable. The development of his criminal methodology during this period was less systematic than other serial killers but reflected his chaotic psychological state and drug-influenced decision-making. His approach remained improvisational and reactive rather than carefully planned. His psychological evolution during this period also involved the development of post-crime rituals and behaviors that helped him process the psychological impact of his violence while maintaining his ability to continue killing. These included drug use, occult practices, and fantasy elaboration. Richard's relationship with law enforcement during his criminal evolution was characterized by contempt and a sense of superiority that was reinforced by his success in avoiding capture. He viewed police as inferior opponents in a supernatural battle. The geographical mobility that characterized Richard's criminal evolution allowed him to avoid the pattern recognition that might have led to earlier capture, while providing him with fresh victim populations and hunting grounds that maintained his psychological engagement. His psychological state by the mid-1980s represented the complete transformation from troubled teenager to apex predator, a drug-fueled, occult-obsessed killer whose chaotic brutality would soon terrorize Southern California and demonstrate how quickly psychological evolution can progress when all inhibiting factors are removed. The psychological foundation for Richard's killing spree was now complete. He had developed the necessary callousness toward human suffering, the technical skills for home invasion and victim control, and the supernatural belief system that justified unlimited violence in service of his dark ideology. His evolution from petty criminal to serial killer demonstrates how quickly psychological deterioration can accelerate when multiple risk factors converge: childhood trauma, substance abuse, social isolation, and exposure to violent ideology can combine to create monsters whose brutality exceeds normal human comprehension. Richard Ramirez had become the Night Stalker, a predator whose psychological evolution from damaged child to chaotic killer represents one of criminal psychology's most dramatic and disturbing transformations, setting the stage for a reign of terror that would challenge everything law enforcement thought they knew about serial killer behavior patterns. June 28, 1984 marked the beginning of a terror campaign that would redefine how America understood random violence and shatter the illusion of safety in our most private spaces. On this night, Richard Ramirez committed his first confirmed murder, crossing a psychological threshold that would unleash a wave of brutality so chaotic and unpredictable that it challenged every established pattern of serial killer behavior. The selection of Jenny Vincow as Richard's first murder victim reveals the opportunistic nature of his criminal psychology. Unlike the careful victim selection of organized killers, Richard's choice was driven by immediate opportunity, drug-fueled impulse, and the random convergence of circumstances that would characterize his entire killing career. Richard's entry into Jenny Vincow's apartment through an unlocked window demonstrates the crude but effective methodology he had developed during his burglary phase. His techniques were not sophisticated, but were adequate for gaining access to victims who had little reason to expect such violent intrusion. The psychological state Richard experienced during his first murder was profoundly influenced by his heavy drug use, particularly PCP and cocaine, which reduced his inhibitions while amplifying his violent impulses. The combination created a perfect storm of psychological disinhibition and physical capability. The extreme violence Richard employed in killing Jenny Vincow, nearly decapitating the 79-year-old woman, reveals the intensity of rage and the complete absence of empathy that characterized his psychological makeup. This wasn't simply killing for practical purposes, but rather an explosive expression of accumulated violence. His decision to ransack the apartment after the murder demonstrates the complex motivations driving his crime's financial gain remained important, but the psychological satisfaction of violation and domination had become equally significant. The crime served multiple psychological needs simultaneously. Richard's immediate post-murder behavior reveals his psychological state following his first killing. Rather than experiencing remorse or psychological breakdown, he felt energized and empowered, interpreting his successful completion of murder as confirmation of his supernatural destiny and demonic protection. The psychological significance of crossing the murder threshold cannot be overstated in Richard's development. Having killed once without immediate consequences, all other forms of violence became psychologically accessible and emotionally acceptable. The final moral barrier had been permanently breached. His ability to return to normal activities following the murder demonstrates the compartmentalization skills he had developed through years of criminal activity and heavy drug use. Richard could shift between his predatory and social personas with disturbing ease. The randomness of Richard's first murder would become his signature characteristic, distinguishing him from other serial killers whose crimes followed predictable patterns. His victim selection was driven by opportunity and impulse rather than systematic stalking or specific preferences. Richard's psychological reaction to the media coverage of his first murder provided him with the recognition and fear he craved, while reinforcing his growing sense of power and supernatural favor. Public terror became psychological validation for his criminal identity. The 3-month gap between his first murder and his next confirmed killing demonstrates the psychological processing time Richard required to fully integrate murder into his criminal repertoire. This period involved extensive fantasy development and mental preparation for escalated violence. His progression from single murder to multiple killing sprees reveals the addictive nature of the psychological satisfaction he derived from violence. Single murders could no longer provide adequate stimulation for his increasingly demanding psyche, requiring escalation in frequency and brutality. Richard's development of home invasion techniques during this period was driven by practical necessity and psychological preference. Breaking into occupied homes provided him with immediate access to victims while satisfying his need to violate private spaces and destroy feelings of safety. The geographical expansion of his hunting territory following his first murder demonstrates his growing confidence and his understanding that mobility was essential for avoiding detection. Richard began viewing all of Southern California as his potential hunting ground. His weapon selection and usage patterns established during his early murders reveal both practical considerations and psychological symbolism. Firearms provided control and intimidation, while knives allowed for more intimate and personally satisfying violence. Richard's interaction patterns with victims during his early crimes show his learning curve in victim control and psychological manipulation. He quickly understood that terror was his most effective tool for maintaining dominance during his attacks. The psychological escalation visible in his early crimes demonstrates how quickly his violence progressed from simple killing to elaborate torture and sexual assault. Each successful crime expanded his understanding of what was possible and psychologically rewarding. His development of signature behaviors during this period reveals the ritualistic aspects of his violence that provided psychological satisfaction beyond simple killing. Specific words, actions, and symbols became important elements of his criminal expression. Richard's relationship with his satanic beliefs became more elaborate following his first murder, as he interpreted his success as evidence of demonic favor while using occult symbolism to terrify victims and mark his crimes. Satan worship became both motivation and methodology. The psychological impact of fear on his victims became a crucial component of Richard's satisfaction. He learned to prolong terror through verbal threats, symbolic actions, and delayed violence, understanding that psychological torture enhanced his sense of power. His ability to enter homes undetected while heavily intoxicated demonstrates the functional aspects of his drug addiction. Substances that might incapacitate normal individuals actually enhanced his criminal capabilities by reducing anxiety and inhibitions. Richard's evolution in evidence elimination and crime scene management was minimal compared to other serial killers, reflecting both his chaotic psychological state and his belief in supernatural protection. He was less concerned with forensic evidence than with immediate psychological satisfaction. The randomness that characterized his early crimes created significant challenges for law enforcement, while providing Richard with operational security. Without predictable patterns, investigators struggled to anticipate his next moves or identify connections between crimes. His psychological preparation for killing became increasingly elaborate as he developed personal rituals involving drug use, music, and occult practices that helped him achieve the psychological state necessary for extreme violence. These rituals became essential components of his criminal process. Richard's victim interaction methodology during his early crimes reveals his sophisticated understanding of fear and control. Despite his otherwise chaotic approach, he could instinctively identify the most effective ways to terrorize and dominate his victims. The psychological rewards Richard derived from his early murders created an immediate addiction that demanded constant escalation. The high he experienced from killing and terrorizing victims became the primary motivation driving his continued criminal activity. His development of entry and escape techniques during this period was driven by practical necessity rather than sophisticated planning. Richard relied on speed, aggression, and luck rather than careful preparation and methodical execution. The psychological significance of nighttime for Richard's crimes reflects both practical considerations and symbolic meaning. Darkness provided operational cover while reinforcing his identification with evil and his role as an agent of supernatural malevolence. His ability to commit crimes across multiple jurisdictions demonstrates his understanding of law enforcement limitations while providing him with expanded hunting grounds and reduced detection risk. Geographic diversity became a crucial element of his operational security. Richard's early crimes established the chaotic, brutal, and seemingly random pattern that would characterize his entire killing career, demonstrating how different forms of criminal psychology can achieve similar levels of destruction through completely different methodological approaches. The psychological foundation established through his early murders would drive Richard to continue killing with increasing frequency and brutality, creating a reign of terror that would challenge every assumption about serial killer behavior while demonstrating the horrifying potential of completely unrestrained human violence. His first criminal acts transformed Richard from a drug-addicted burglar into one of America's most feared serial killers, proving that the transition from property crime to murder can occur with shocking rapidity when all psychological and social restraints are removed through trauma, substance abuse, and ideological corruption. The psychological momentum generated by Richard's early successes in avoiding capture while achieving maximum psychological satisfaction through extreme violence created an unstoppable trajectory toward escalating brutality that would terrorize Southern California for over a year, demonstrating how quickly criminal psychology can evolve from troubled to monstrous when all inhibiting factors are eliminated. Unlike the systematic precision of other serial killers, Richard Ramirez's criminal methodology was characterized by chaos, unpredictability, and spontaneous brutality that made him virtually impossible to profile or anticipate. His approach to murder was less methodical strategy than drug-fueled improvisation, creating a reign of terror that defied traditional understanding of serial killer behavior patterns. Richard's victim selection process was fundamentally opportunistic rather than systematic, driven by immediate availability and perceived vulnerability rather than specific psychological or physical criteria. His targets ranged across age groups, ethnicities, and social classes, creating confusion among investigators seeking patterns. The geographical methodology Richard employed involved constantly shifting hunting grounds across Southern California's vast urban sprawl. His mobility between different communities and jurisdictions prevented pattern recognition while providing him with fresh victim populations and escape routes. His timing preferences revealed both practical and psychological considerations. Nighttime attacks provided operational cover while satisfying his identification with darkness and evil. Richard understood that people were most vulnerable in their homes during sleeping hours when their defenses were lowest. Richard's entry techniques were crude but effective, relying on unlocked doors and windows rather than sophisticated breaking and entering methods. His approach prioritized speed and surprise over technical skill, understanding that most residents were unprepared for violent intrusion. The weapon methodology Richard developed was characterized by versatility and availability rather than specialization. He used whatever weapons were accessible: stolen firearms, knives, household items, or his own physical strength, adapting his violence to immediate circumstances rather than preferred methods. His victim control techniques relied heavily on immediate, overwhelming violence and terror rather than psychological manipulation or restraint systems. Richard understood that complete domination through shocking brutality was more effective than gradual intimidation for maintaining victim compliance. The violence escalation patterns within individual crimes reveal Richard's psychological need for increasingly intense stimulation. Attacks typically began with intimidation, but rapidly escalated to extreme brutality as his psychological needs demanded greater expressions of power and control. Richard's sexual assault methodology was characterized by degradation and domination rather than sexual satisfaction alone. These attacks served multiple psychological functions, including power expression, victim humiliation, and ritualistic elements related to his satanic beliefs and practices. His post-murder behavior within crime scenes reveals the ritualistic aspects of his violence that provided psychological satisfaction beyond simple killing. Richard engaged in symbolic actions, occult references, and trophy-taking that served his supernatural belief system. The evidence management aspect of Richard's methodology was minimal and chaotic. reflecting both his drug-impaired judgment and his belief in supernatural protection. He left fingerprints, witnesses, and physical evidence with little concern for forensic detection. Richard's escape methodology relied on speed, local knowledge, and the element of surprise rather than careful planning or sophisticated counter-surveillance. His ability to disappear into the urban landscape was more dependent on luck and mobility than systematic preparation. His victim interaction patterns reveal a sophisticated understanding of fear psychology despite his otherwise chaotic approach. Richard knew exactly how to terrorize victims through specific threats, symbolic actions, and unpredictable violence that maximize psychological impact. The torture methodologies Richard employed were driven by psychological satisfaction rather than information extraction, focusing on victim suffering and his own sense of absolute power. His techniques varied based on opportunity and impulse rather than systematic torture knowledge. Richard's crime scene behavior demonstrates his need to mark his presence and claim psychological ownership of the violation. Graffiti, symbolic arrangements, and deliberate evidence placement served his ego and supernatural belief system while terrorizing investigators. His adaptation capabilities allowed Richard to modify his approach based on changing circumstances and increase law enforcement pressure. Despite his chaotic nature, he could adjust timing, locations, and techniques to maintain operational effectiveness. The psychological preparation Richard employed before crimes involved drug use, music, and occult rituals that helped him achieve the mental state necessary for extreme violence. These preparations became essential components of his criminal process. His victim assessment methodology was rapid and intuitive rather than systematic, relying on immediate impressions of vulnerability and opportunity. Richard could quickly evaluate potential targets and situations for maximum advantage with minimal risk. The transportation aspects of Richard's methodology relied on stolen vehicles, public transportation, and walking, providing him with mobility while avoiding the tracking possibilities of consistent vehicle usage. His transportation was as chaotic and unpredictable as his other criminal behaviors. Richard's communication methodology with victims served multiple psychological functions, including terror induction, power demonstration, and occult symbolism. His verbal patterns became signature elements that helped link crimes while providing psychological satisfaction. His timing methodology within individual crimes reveals understanding of victim psychology and household dynamics. Richard knew when residents were most vulnerable and how to exploit domestic routines for maximum operational advantage. The disposal methodology for weapons and evidence was haphazard and opportunistic, reflecting both his impaired judgment and his supernatural beliefs. Richard often discarded items carelessly, relying on luck and mobility rather than systematic evidence elimination. His surveillance techniques were minimal and impromptu rather than systematic, relying on brief observation and immediate opportunity assessment. Richard's approach prioritized spontaneity over careful preparation and extended target analysis. The psychological rewards Richard derived from his methodology were complex and multifaceted, including power satisfaction, terror induction, occult fulfillment, and drug-enhanced euphoria. Each crime provided multiple forms of psychological gratification through different methodological elements. Richard's adaptation to law enforcement pressure involved geographic expansion, timing changes, and technique modifications while maintaining his core methodological approach. His flexibility allowed continued operations despite increasing investigative attention. His weapon acquisition methodology was opportunistic and varied, including theft, purchase, and improvisation. Richard understood that weapon availability was crucial for maintaining victim control, but didn't develop sophisticated procurement systems. The psychological escalation methodology Richard employed within his criminal career involved increasing frequency, expanding victim categories, and intensifying violence levels. His need for greater stimulation drove continuous methodological evolution and escalation. His risk assessment capabilities were impaired by drug use and grandiose beliefs, but still functioned adequately for operational security. Richard could evaluate immediate threats and opportunities despite his otherwise chaotic psychological state. The documentation aspects of Richard's methodology were mental rather than physical, relying on memory and fantasy elaboration rather than written records or trophy collection. His psychological processing of crimes occurred through internal review and occult interpretation. Richard's team methodology was essentially solitary, reflecting both his paranoid psychology and his belief in supernatural guidance. He operated alone to maintain complete control while avoiding the complications of criminal partnerships. His victim manipulation techniques relied on terror and unpredictability rather than charm or deception. Richard understood that overwhelming fear was more effective for his purposes than subtle psychological manipulation or false reassurance. The temporal methodology Richard employed in crime execution prioritized speed and intensity over extended interaction. His attacks were brutal and brief, designed to achieve maximum psychological impact while minimizing exposure time and detection risk. His learning methodology involved experiential adaptation rather than systematic study, improving his techniques through trial and error while maintaining his fundamentally chaotic approach. Each crime provided operational intelligence for future attacks. Richard Ramirez's criminal methodology represents the antithesis of organized serial killing, a chaotic, drug-fueled, occult-driven approach that achieved maximum terror through unpredictability and extreme brutality rather than systematic precision, demonstrating that criminal effectiveness can emerge from chaos as well as careful planning. His methodological legacy challenges traditional understanding of serial killer behavior patterns while demonstrating the horrifying potential of completely unrestrained criminal psychology, operating without systematic constraints or predictable patterns, creating terror through pure randomness and unlimited violence. The victim selection psychology of Richard Ramirez defied every established pattern in criminal profiling, creating a nightmare scenario for law enforcement where potential targets could be anyone, anywhere, at any time. His approach to choosing victims was driven by opportunity, impulse, and drug-fueled randomness rather than systematic criteria, making him virtually impossible to predict or prevent. Richard's victim demographic diversity was unprecedented among serial killers, spanning ages from children to elderly adults, multiple ethnic backgrounds, various socioeconomic levels, and both genders. This randomness was not accidental, but reflected his chaotic psychological state and opportunistic criminal methodology. The geographical distribution of his victim selection reveals Richard's understanding of Southern California's urban landscape and his ability to exploit the anonymity provided by the region's vast metropolitan sprawl. He could disappear into any neighborhood while finding suitable targets across multiple communities. Richard's opportunistic selection process was driven by immediate availability rather than stalking or careful target assessment. His victims were chosen based on accessibility, perceived vulnerability, and random encounter, rather than specific psychological or physical characteristics that appealed to his preferences. The temporal patterns in his victim selection were influenced by his nocturnal lifestyle, drug use patterns, and understanding of when potential targets would be most vulnerable. Richard preferred attacking during late night and early morning hours, when victims were sleeping and less likely to resist effectively. His economic target analysis was minimal but functional. Richard understood that middle-class neighborhoods provided optimal combinations of valuable property and manageable security measures. Extremely wealthy areas had better security, while poor areas offered fewer rewards for the risks involved. The psychological vulnerability factors Richard instinctively recognized included social isolation, physical frailty, and psychological unpreparedness for violent attack. His ability to quickly assess victim capability and likelihood of resistance was remarkably accurate despite his chaotic state. Richard's age-diverse victim selection reveals his different motivational factors for different types of targets. Elderly victims provided easy domination and minimal resistance, while younger victims offered sexual assault opportunities and greater terror satisfaction through their increased awareness of their suffering. His gender selection patterns were influenced by both opportunity and specific psychological needs. Female victims satisfied his sexual assault compulsions and need for complete domination, while male victims provided challenges to his sense of power and opportunities to demonstrate ultimate superiority. The family unit targeting that characterized some of Richard's crimes represents his most psychologically complex victim selection. Attacking entire families provided multiple forms of satisfaction, including power demonstration, witness elimination, and extended terror scenarios that maximized his psychological rewards. Richard's racial and ethnic targeting patterns were random rather than motivated by specific prejudices, reflecting the diversity of Southern California's population and his opportunistic approach rather than systematic bias or hate-motivated selection criteria. His assessment of physical security measures was functional despite his chaotic state. Richard could quickly evaluate home security, access points, and escape routes while identifying properties that offered optimal risk-reward ratios for his criminal activities. The urban versus suburban targeting preferences in Richard's victim selection reflect his understanding of different environments' advantages and disadvantages. Suburban areas provided better access and escape routes, while urban areas offered greater anonymity and victim diversity. His victim lifestyle analysis was minimal but effective. Richard understood that people with regular routines and predictable schedules were easier to attack successfully. He could identify patterns of vulnerability without extensive surveillance or systematic stalking. Richard's selection of occupied versus unoccupied homes reveals his psychological preferences for terrorizing living victims rather than simply committing burglary. Empty homes offered property theft opportunities, but occupied homes provided the psychological satisfaction of domination and terror. The weapon availability factors in his victim selection included assessment of potential defensive capabilities and access to improvised weapons within target homes. Richard preferred attacking locations where he could maintain weapon superiority throughout the encounter. His escape route evaluation was a crucial component of victim selection, as Richard needed quick access to transportation and multiple exit options to avoid capture after committing his crimes. Geographic knowledge influenced his targeting decisions significantly. Richard's victim social network analysis was superficial but adequate for avoiding immediate detection. He understood that attacking isolated individuals or families with minimal local connections provided more time before disappearances would be discovered and investigated. The psychological state assessment Richard conducted of potential victims involved evaluating their likely responses to sudden violence and their capacity for resistance or cooperation. His ability to read victim psychology was remarkably accurate despite his impaired mental state. His selection of single versus multiple victim scenarios was driven by both opportunity and psychological needs. Single victims provided focused domination experiences, while multiple victims offered extended terror scenarios and greater psychological satisfaction through complex power dynamics. Richard's targeting of specific room configurations and home layouts reveals his understanding of tactical advantages and victim control requirements. He preferred homes with manageable layouts that facilitated victim control while providing adequate escape options. The technological considerations in his victim selection were minimal given the 1980s timeframe, but Richard understood basic security systems and communication capabilities that might complicate his attacks or accelerate law enforcement response. His victim selection timing relative to neighborhood activity patterns demonstrates Richard's awareness of witness potential and community surveillance. He could identify optimal attack windows when external intervention was least likely. The economic motivation factors in Richard's victim selection were secondary to psychological satisfaction, but still influenced his targeting decisions. Properties with obvious wealth indicators attracted his attention while also providing financial benefits from his crimes. Richard's assessment of victim capability for identification and testimony influenced his selection process, as he understood that certain victims would be more dangerous to his continued freedom if they survived to provide law enforcement with detailed descriptions. His selection methodology evolution throughout his criminal career shows minimal systematic learning, reflecting his chaotic psychology and drug-impaired decision-making. His targeting remained essentially random and opportunistic throughout his killing spree. The supernatural belief influences on Richard's victim selection included his interpretation of signs, omens, and satanic guidance that he believed directed him towards specific targets. His occult beliefs provided psychological justification for seemingly random selection decisions. Richard's victim selection methodology represents the extreme opposite of systematic predatory behavior. His targets were chosen through chaos, impulse, and random opportunity rather than careful stalking and preference-based criteria, creating a nightmare scenario where anyone could become a victim. The psychological impact of his random selection process on community fear was enormous, as residents understood that traditional safety measures and behavioral precautions offered no protection against an attacker whose victims were chosen through pure chance and opportunity. His victim selection psychology demonstrates how effective terror can be created through complete unpredictability rather than systematic targeting, proving that random violence can be as psychologically rewarding for perpetrators and as devastating for communities as carefully planned attacks. The legacy of Richard's victim selection methodology challenged law enforcement profiling techniques and community safety strategies, demonstrating that some criminals operate outside all established patterns and that protection against truly random violence requires entirely different approaches than those designed for systematic predators. Richard Ramirez's approach to victim selection represents criminal psychology at its most chaotic and unpredictable, proving that the absence of systematic methodology can be as terrifying and effective as the most sophisticated criminal planning, creating a reign of terror where safety was purely a matter of random chance. The environmental conditions that enabled Richard Ramirez's reign of terror represent a perfect storm of urban geography, social dynamics, and cultural factors that transformed Los Angeles into an ideal hunting ground for a chaotic predator. The sprawling metropolis provided anonymity, opportunity, and operational advantages that allowed an unpredictable killer to terrorize millions while evading capture for over a year. Los Angeles in the mid-1980s was a city in transition, experiencing rapid demographic changes, urban expansion, and social upheaval that created the perfect conditions for Richard's predatory activities. The metropolitan area's vast size and diverse population provided him with unlimited hunting opportunities and operational security. The climate factors of Southern California played a crucial role in Richard's criminal activities, as warm weather encouraged open windows and doors while making nighttime movement comfortable and practical. The mild climate extended his operational season and provided optimal conditions for his preferred nocturnal hunting patterns. Richard's exploitation of Los Angeles's freeway system demonstrates his understanding of urban geography and mobility. Advantages. The extensive highway network allowed him to strike across multiple jurisdictions while providing rapid escape routes and the ability to disappear into the metropolitan sprawl. The suburban development patterns of 1980 seconds Los Angeles created ideal hunting grounds for Richard's home invasion methodology. New neighborhoods with similar housing designs, minimal security features, and isolated locations provided him with optimal target environments and operational advantages. The social environment of Reagan-era Los Angeles, with its emphasis on individual success and reduced community involvement, created conditions where neighbors were less likely to know each other or monitor suspicious activity. This social atomization provided Richard with operational security and reduced detection risk. Richard's understanding of neighborhood demographics allowed him to select optimal hunting areas based on population density, economic status, and law enforcement presence. Middle-class suburban areas provided the perfect balance of opportunity and security for his criminal activities. The technological limitations of the mid-1980s worked to Richard's advantage by limiting communication capabilities, security systems, and forensic techniques available to both potential victims and law enforcement agencies. These limitations provided him with operational advantages that would not exist today. The media environment of the period created additional advantages for Richard's operations while providing him with the recognition and terror he craved. Television and newspaper coverage spread fear throughout the community while providing him with intelligence about investigative progress and public response. Richard's exploitation of Los Angeles's public transportation system provided him with mobility and anonymity while avoiding the tracking possibilities of consistent vehicle ownership. Buses, trains, and taxis allowed him to move throughout the metropolitan area without creating detectable patterns. The economic conditions of mid-1980s Los Angeles created social dynamics that Richard could exploit, including economic inequality, transient populations, and areas of urban decay that provided him with operational bases and reduced law enforcement attention. The geographical features of Southern California provided Richard with tactical advantages, including mountainous terrain for disposal activities, desert areas for evidence destruction, and complex urban landscapes for concealment and escape. The varied topography served his operational needs effectively. Richard's understanding of local law enforcement jurisdictions allowed him to exploit coordination problems and communication gaps between different agencies. His crimes crossed multiple police territories, creating investigative complications that provided him with operational security. The cultural environment of 1980 seconds Los Angeles, with its emphasis on individual freedom and reduced social oversight, created conditions where suspicious behavior was less likely to be reported or investigated. This cultural tolerance for eccentricity provided Richard with camouflage for his criminal activities. The immigration patterns and demographic diversity of Los Angeles provided Richard with environments where he could blend in, while also creating communication barriers that complicated witness cooperation and police investigations. Linguistic and cultural factors worked to his advantage. Richard's exploitation of the area's nightlife and 24-hour activity patterns allowed him to move through the city during late hours without attracting attention. Los Angeles's round-the-clock culture provided him with cover for nocturnal activities and reduced the suspiciousness of late-night movement. The housing market conditions of the mid-1980s created specific vulnerabilities that Richard could exploit, including newer developments with minimal security features, rental properties with transient populations, and suburban expansion into previously undeveloped areas with limited police coverage. The drug culture prevalent in 1980s Los Angeles provided Richard with access to substances that fueled his violence, while also creating criminal networks and activity patterns that provided him with operational intelligence and resources for his activities. Richard's understanding of seasonal patterns in Southern California allowed him to optimize his criminal activities based on weather conditions, tourist populations, and law enforcement resource allocation. He could adapt his timing to environmental factors that affected his operational effectiveness. The technological infrastructure of mid-1980s Los Angeles provided Richard with advantages including limited surveillance capabilities, basic communication systems, and minimal security features in residential areas. These limitations reduced detection risk while providing him with operational freedom. The social mobility patterns of Los Angeles residents created predictable vulnerability windows that Richard could exploit. Work schedules, entertainment patterns, and travel behaviors provided him with timing intelligence for optimal attack planning. Richard's exploitation of the area's entertainment and tourism infrastructure provided him with cover for suspicious behavior while also creating opportunities for victim identification. The city's focus on hospitality and openness created vulnerabilities he could systematically exploit. The environmental psychology of Los Angeles suburbs, with their emphasis on privacy and individual space, created conditions where residents were isolated and vulnerable while also being less likely to seek help or intervene in suspicious situations. The industrial and commercial development patterns of the region provided Richard with operational advantages, including abandoned buildings for temporary shelter, industrial areas for evidence disposal, and commercial districts for resource acquisition and operational planning. Richard's understanding of local traffic patterns allowed him to optimize his timing for both criminal activities and escape procedures. Rush hour congestion, weekend patterns, and special events created predictable movement opportunities that he could exploit effectively. The governmental structure of Los Angeles County, with its complex web of municipal jurisdictions and law enforcement agencies, created coordination problems and communication gaps that Richard could exploit to avoid detection and capture. The environmental factors surrounding water resources, including reservoirs, flood channels, and coastal areas, provided Richard with disposal opportunities and escape routes while also creating geographical barriers that could complicate law enforcement pursuit and investigation. Richard's exploitation of the region's educational institutions provided him with additional victim populations and operational intelligence. Universities and schools created concentrations of potential targets while also providing environmental cover for suspicious behavior. The construction and development boom of 1982 Los Angeles created environmental conditions that Richard could exploit, including work sites for tool acquisition, new developments with minimal security, and construction activity that provided cover for suspicious behavior. The cultural attitudes toward crime and safety in mid-1980s Los Angeles created environmental conditions where residents were unprepared for the level of violence Richard represented. Community complacency about security provided him with operational advantages. The environmental legacy of Richard's crimes includes lasting changes to residential security practices, law enforcement procedures, and community safety awareness that persists decades later. His exploitation of environmental factors led to systematic changes designed to prevent future similar crimes. Richard Ramirez's environmental exploitation demonstrates how geographical, social, and cultural factors can combine to create optimal conditions for criminal activity, proving that environmental awareness is crucial for both criminal prevention and investigative success in complex urban environments. The environmental factors that enabled Richard's crimes provide crucial lessons about urban vulnerability and the importance of comprehensive approaches to community safety that address not just individual behaviors, but also the environmental conditions that can enable and facilitate criminal activity. The escalation patterns in Richard Ramirez's criminal career defy traditional understanding of serial killer development. characterized not by gradual progression but by explosive acceleration driven by drug addiction, supernatural beliefs, and an insatiable need for increasingly intense psychological stimulation that demanded constant escalation in frequency, brutality, and psychological complexity. Richard's initial escalation from burglary to murder represents one of criminal psychology's most dramatic leaps, occurring not through gradual progression, but through a sudden psychological breakthrough that shattered all remaining moral constraints and unleashed his full capacity for violence within a remarkably compressed time frame. The frequency escalation in Richard's crimes reveals the addictive nature of the psychological satisfaction he derived from violence and terror. What began as isolated incidents rapidly accelerated to multiple attacks per month as his tolerance for psychological stimulation increased and his need for violent expression became insatiable. His geographical escalation demonstrates both growing confidence and increasing desperation for fresh hunting grounds that could provide adequate psychological stimulation. Richard expanded his territory throughout Southern California, as familiar areas became insufficient for his escalating psychological needs. The victim count escalation within individual crimes reflects Richard's growing appetite for complex power dynamics and extended terror scenarios. Single victim attacks evolved into family annihilations as his need for psychological dominance required increasingly elaborate expressions of control. Richard's weapon escalation reveals his evolving understanding of violence as both practical tool and psychological expression. His arsenal expanded from simple firearms to elaborate collections of weapons that served different psychological functions within his increasingly complex criminal rituals. The brutality escalation visible throughout Richard's career demonstrates his progressive desensitization to violence and his corresponding need for increasingly extreme stimulation. Acts that initially provided psychological satisfaction became routine, requiring constant escalation to achieve the same psychological rewards. His torture methodology escalation shows the evolution from quick kills to extended suffering scenarios. As Richard discovered that prolonged victim terror provided superior psychological satisfaction to simple murder, his techniques became increasingly elaborate and psychologically sophisticated. The sexual violence escalation in Richard's crimes reflects both his growing confidence and his increasing need for complete victim domination. Sexual assault evolved from opportunity-driven attacks to central components of his criminal expression and psychological satisfaction. Richard's psychological escalation in victim interaction reveals his growing sophistication in terror induction and mind control. His ability to psychologically manipulate and terrorize victims became increasingly refined and deliberate as his experience accumulated. The symbolic escalation in Richard's crimes demonstrates the growing importance of occult elements and supernatural beliefs in his criminal expression. Satanic symbols, ritualistic behaviors, and supernatural references became increasingly prominent and elaborate components of his attacks. His risk-taking escalation reflects the classic serial killer pattern of growing overconfidence combined with increasing psychological needs that demanded more dangerous operational choices. Richard's willingness to accept higher risks grew exponentially as his addiction to violence intensified. The timing escalation between Richard's crimes shows the acceleration of his psychological deterioration and his increasing inability to achieve satisfaction through nonviolent means. The intervals between attacks shortened dramatically as his tolerance for normal psychological states decreased. Richard's escalation in crime scene elaboration reveals his growing need for personal expression and psychological marking of his territory. Simple attacks evolved into complex scenarios with multiple symbolic elements that served his ego and supernatural belief system. The violence escalation within individual attacks demonstrates Richard's progressive loss of impulse control and his increasing need for extreme stimulation. Attacks that began with simple intimidation rapidly escalated to extreme brutality as his psychological needs demanded maximum intensity. His escalation in victim targeting sophistication shows growing confidence in his ability to identify and exploit optimal targets while managing increased law enforcement pressure. His selection criteria became more refined even as his violence became more extreme. The technological escalation in Richard's crimes was minimal due to the 1980s timeframe, but his adaptation to available technology demonstrates his ability to incorporate new tools and techniques into his evolving criminal methodology. Richard's escalation in post-crime behavior reveals the growing importance of psychological processing and fantasy elaboration in maintaining his criminal momentum. His post-attack rituals became increasingly elaborate and psychologically necessary for continued operations. The communication escalation in Richard's crimes shows his growing need for recognition and his increasing confidence in taunting law enforcement and the public. His verbal interactions with victims and symbolic messages became more elaborate and psychologically sophisticated. His escalation in evidence manipulation reflects growing sophistication in crime scene management combined with increasing grandiosity about his supernatural protection. Richard became more deliberate about evidence while also becoming more reckless due to his beliefs. The psychological preparation escalation for Richard's crimes involved increasingly elaborate rituals and procedures designed to achieve optimal mental states for extreme violence. His pre-crime preparations became essential components of his criminal process. Richard's escalation in operational complexity demonstrates his ability to manage increasingly elaborate criminal scenarios while maintaining the spontaneity and chaos that characterized his approach. His crimes became more complex without losing their unpredictable nature. The drug use escalation throughout Richard's criminal career served as both fuel and catalyst for his violent escalation. Increasing substance abuse reduced his inhibitions while amplifying his violent impulses and supernatural beliefs, creating a feedback loop of escalating chemical and psychological dependence. His escalation in territorial expansion reflects both growing confidence and increasing psychological demands that required fresh hunting grounds and victim populations. Richard's operational area expanded throughout Southern California as his needs outgrew local resources. The fantasy escalation that drove Richard's criminal development involved increasingly elaborate and demanding scenarios that required reality-based implementation. His mental rehearsals became so complex and specific that only actual crimes could provide adequate psychological satisfaction. Richard's escalation in victim control techniques reveals his growing sophistication in psychological manipulation and terror induction. Despite his otherwise chaotic approach, his ability to dominate and terrorize victims became increasingly refined and effective. The media attention escalation surrounding Richard's crimes provided him with the recognition and validation he craved, while also increasing the pressure and excitement that fueled his continued escalation. Public fear became psychological fuel for his criminal development. His escalation in crime scene duration reflects his growing confidence and his increasing need for extended victim interaction and psychological satisfaction. Quick attacks evolved into prolonged terror scenarios that provided greater psychological rewards. The psychological deterioration escalation visible throughout Richard's career demonstrates the unsustainable nature of his criminal trajectory. His mental state became increasingly unstable and detached from reality as his escalation demands exceeded his psychological capacity. Richard's escalation in supernatural beliefs and occult practices reveals the growing importance of these elements in maintaining his criminal motivation and psychological justification. His satanic ideology became increasingly elaborate and central to his criminal identity. The escalation patterns in Richard Ramirez's criminal career represent one of criminal psychology's most dramatic examples of rapid psychological deterioration and violence escalation, demonstrating how quickly criminal behavior can spiral beyond all control when driven by addiction, ideology, and psychological pathology. His escalation trajectory was ultimately unsustainable, creating the conditions that would lead to his capture while demonstrating the horrifying potential for human violence when all psychological and social constraints are removed through trauma, substance abuse, and ideological corruption. The legacy of Richard's escalation patterns continues to influence understanding of criminal development and the importance of early intervention before escalation reaches critical thresholds where prevention becomes impossible and societal protection requires elimination of the threat through capture and incarceration. The investigation of Richard Ramirez's crimes represents one of law enforcement's greatest challenges in confronting a completely unpredictable predator whose random methodology defied every established investigative technique and criminal profiling system. The psychological warfare between a chaotic killer and systematic investigators created a nightmare scenario where traditional police work proved inadequate against pure randomness and unlimited brutality. The initial investigative response to Richard's crimes was hindered by the complete absence of recognizable patterns that could guide traditional police work. Investigators faced an unprecedented challenge: a killer whose victim selection, methodology, and timing were so random that standard profiling techniques provided no useful guidance. Richard's crimes created jurisdictional nightmares as attacks spread across multiple police departments throughout Southern California, creating coordination problems and communication gaps that provided him with operational advantages while frustrating investigative efforts and delaying pattern recognition. The psychological impact on investigating officers was severe and unprecedented, as detectives confronted crime scenes of such random brutality and symbolic complexity that traditional emotional coping mechanisms proved inadequate. The investigation took a profound psychological toll on everyone involved. Richard's ability to remain undetected despite leaving extensive physical evidence reveals the limitations of 1980 seconds forensic technology and the challenges of processing evidence from such a large number of diverse crime scenes scattered across multiple jurisdictions and timeframes. The media pressure surrounding the investigation created additional psychological stress for law enforcement while providing Richard with the recognition and terror validation he craved. Press coverage became a double-edged sword that both helped and hindered investigative efforts. The development of the Night Stalker task force represented an unprecedented law enforcement response that brought together multiple agencies and jurisdictions in an attempt to coordinate efforts against a killer whose randomness made traditional investigative approaches ineffective. Richard's psychological advantage over investigators stemmed from his complete unpredictability and his understanding that chaos was his greatest weapon against systematic law enforcement approaches. His random methodology created investigative paralysis and resource allocation problems. The witness interview challenges created by Richard's crimes were enormous, as traumatized survivors struggled to provide coherent accounts of attacks that were so brutal and chaotic that normal memory and perception systems were overwhelmed by the psychological trauma. Richard's fingerprint evidence accumulation eventually provided investigators with their breakthrough, but the processing and comparison of prints from multiple crime scenes across different jurisdictions required unprecedented coordination and technological resources for the 1980s timeframe. The psychological profiling attempts conducted during the investigation were largely unsuccessful due to Richard's chaotic methodology and random victim selection. Traditional profiling techniques that relied on behavioral patterns and psychological consistency proved inadequate for analyzing his crimes. The community fear generated by Richard's random attacks created additional pressure on investigators while providing him with psychological satisfaction. The terror he generated throughout Southern California became a weapon against law enforcement effectiveness and public cooperation. Richard's supernatural beliefs and occult symbolism created additional investigative challenges as detectives struggled to understand the significance of ritualistic elements and symbolic behaviors that were outside their normal experience and training. The resource allocation problems created by Richard's crimes were enormous, as multiple agencies struggled to coordinate efforts across vast geographical areas while processing evidence from numerous crime scenes that showed no apparent connections beyond their extreme brutality. The investigative timeline pressure created by Richard's accelerating attack frequency forced law enforcement to work at an unprecedented pace while maintaining accuracy and thoroughness in evidence processing and analysis across multiple complex crime scenes. Richard's weapon diversity and evidence distribution across multiple locations created logistical nightmares for investigators who had to coordinate searches, evidence processing, and witness interviews across Southern California's vast metropolitan area. The technological limitations of mid-1980s law enforcement proved crucial in allowing Richard's continued operations, as communication systems, database capabilities, and forensic techniques were inadequate for the coordination and analysis required by such a complex case. The psychological warfare Richard conducted against investigators included deliberate evidence placement, symbolic messaging, and behavioral choices designed to confuse and frustrate law enforcement while demonstrating his perceived superiority and supernatural protection. Richard's mobility advantages over static investigative resources created ongoing challenges, as he could strike anywhere throughout the region, while investigators had to coordinate responses across multiple jurisdictions with varying capabilities and communication systems. The witness protection and support challenges created by Richard's crimes were unprecedented, as survivors faced ongoing terror from an attacker who remained at large while also dealing with the psychological trauma of their experiences. The evidence analysis complications created by Richard's chaotic methodology included contaminated crime scenes, diverse weapon usage, and victim interactions that provided limited useful intelligence for predicting future attacks or understanding behavioral patterns. Richard's psychological impact on investigative decision-making created pressure for results that sometimes led to premature conclusions or resource misallocation as agencies struggled to show progress against a seemingly unstoppable and unpredictable killer. The interagency cooperation challenges highlighted by Richard's case included communication problems, jurisdictional disputes, and resource competition that provided him with operational advantages while hindering coordinated law enforcement responses. The public information management aspects of the investigation required careful balance between warning communities about the ongoing threat while avoiding panic that could hinder investigative efforts or provide Richard with additional psychological satisfaction. Richard's crime scene behavior analysis revealed his psychological needs and supernatural beliefs, but provided limited predictive value due to the random and chaotic nature of his site selection and victim interaction patterns. The investigative learning curve required by Richard's case involved developing new techniques and approaches for dealing with random criminal behavior that defied traditional law enforcement methodologies and psychological profiling systems. The evidence preservation challenges created by the scale and complexity of Richard's crimes required unprecedented coordination and resources as investigators struggled to maintain chain of custody and analytical capability across multiple jurisdictions and timeframes. Richard's psychological advantage in understanding investigative procedures came from his exposure to law enforcement through media coverage and his intuitive understanding that chaos was his greatest weapon against systematic approaches to criminal investigation. The breakthrough moment in Richard's case came through traditional police work, fingerprint identification, rather than sophisticated profiling or behavioral analysis, demonstrating that basic investigative techniques remain crucial even in cases involving complex psychological pathology. The post-identification manhunt psychology involved coordinating resources across multiple agencies while managing public fear and media attention that could either help or hinder efforts to locate and capture Richard before he could commit additional crimes. Richard's capture psychology reveals the ultimate limitations of random criminal methodology when confronted with systematic law enforcement resources and community cooperation. His chaotic approach eventually created the conditions that led to his identification and apprehension. The investigative legacy of Richard's case includes lasting changes to multi-jurisdictional cooperation procedures, evidence-sharing systems, and psychological support resources for law enforcement personnel dealing with extreme violence and community terror. The psychological lessons learned from investigating Richard's crimes continue to influence law enforcement training and procedures for dealing with random violence and unpredictable criminal behavior that defies traditional investigative approaches and criminal profiling techniques. Richard Ramirez's investigation represents a watershed moment in criminal justice that demonstrated both the limitations of traditional police work when confronted with pure randomness and the ultimate effectiveness of systematic law enforcement when provided with adequate resources and coordination capabilities. The psychological impact of Richard's investigation on law enforcement methodology continues to influence approaches to random violence and unpredictable criminal behavior, proving that even the most chaotic criminals can be captured through persistent application of basic investigative principles combined with unprecedented coordination and resource allocation. August 31, 1985. Marked the end of Richard Ramirez's reign of terror, but his capture came not through sophisticated investigative breakthrough, but through a combination of forensic technology, community vigilance, and the ultimate failure of his chaotic methodology to provide sustainable operational security. The dramatic circumstances of his apprehension reveal how even the most unpredictable criminals eventually create the conditions for their own downfall. The breakthrough in Richard's case came through fingerprint identification rather than behavioral profiling or pattern analysis, demonstrating that traditional forensic techniques remain crucial even when dealing with criminals whose psychological methodology defied conventional understanding and investigative approaches. Richard's fingerprint, left on a stolen vehicle, provided investigators with their first concrete lead after months of frustration, proving that his chaotic evidence management and belief in supernatural protection were ultimately inadequate against systematic forensic analysis and database comparison capabilities. The psychological significance of Richard's identification through fingerprints was enormous for investigators who had struggled with his random methodology for over a year. Finally, having a name and face to associate with the terror provided both relief and renewed energy for the investigation. The media release of Richard's photograph and identity information represented a calculated risk that could either facilitate his capture through public assistance or drive him deeper underground, where he might become even more dangerous and difficult to locate. Richard's psychological state during the period between his identification and capture reveals the mental deterioration that resulted from sustained drug abuse, extreme violence, and the psychological pressure of maintaining his criminal activities while believing in his own supernatural invincibility. The community response to Richard's identification demonstrates the profound psychological impact his crimes had on Southern California residents, as the publication of his photograph triggered widespread fear, vigilance, and determination to assist in his capture through citizen cooperation. Richard's attempt to continue his activities after being identified shows both his psychological addiction to violence and his impaired judgment regarding the changed circumstances of his situation. His need for criminal stimulation overcame his survival instincts and practical intelligence. The failed carjacking attempt that ultimately led to Richard's capture reveals how his deteriorated psychological state and desperation created the exact conditions that would result in his apprehension by an aroused and vigilant community determined to stop his reign of terror. The citizen response that led to Richard's capture demonstrates the power of community mobilization against criminal predators, as ordinary residents overcame their fear to confront and detain a killer whose reputation for extreme violence had terrorized the entire region. Richard's psychological experience during his capture and beating by community members represents a complete reversal of his accustomed power dynamics, as he went from being a figure of ultimate terror to a helpless victim of collective community rage and determination. The police rescue of Richard from the angry crowd ironically saved his life while ensuring his prosecution, preventing the street justice that might have robbed the community of legal closure and the justice system of the opportunity to formally process his crimes. Richard's psychological state during initial questioning reveals the complex interaction between his grandiose beliefs, his deteriorated mental condition, and his sudden transition from predator to captured suspect facing the consequences of his criminal career. The media circus surrounding Richard's capture provided him with the attention and notoriety he had craved while also exposing the full extent of his crimes to public scrutiny and ensuring that his victims and their families would receive recognition and validation. Richard's courtroom behavior during his initial appearances demonstrates his continued need for attention and control even in captivity, as he used legal proceedings as a platform for expressing his satanic beliefs and maintaining his terrorizing presence. The psychological impact of Richard's capture on his surviving victims was complex, providing both relief that their attacker had been stopped and renewed trauma as they faced the prospect of testifying about their experiences and reliving their attacks through legal proceedings. The investigation's completion following Richard's capture revealed the full scope of his criminal activities and provided closure for families and communities that had lived in terror, while also demonstrating the effectiveness of coordinated law enforcement efforts when provided with adequate resources. Richard's confession patterns during questioning were minimal and uncooperative, reflecting both his psychological detachment from his crimes and his understanding that cooperation would not benefit his legal situation or satisfy his psychological needs for dominance and control. The forensic evidence compilation that followed Richard's capture confirmed the connections between crimes that investigators had suspected but couldn't prove, providing definitive links that would be crucial for prosecution while also revealing the full extent of his criminal career. Richard's psychological evaluation during the legal process revealed the complex interaction between his substance abuse, supernatural beliefs, and antisocial pathology that had created one of criminal history's most unpredictable and dangerous predators. The legal strategy challenges created by Richard's case included managing his disruptive courtroom behavior, addressing his mental health issues, and presenting the overwhelming evidence of his crimes in a coherent manner that would ensure conviction and appropriate punishment. Richard's continued media fascination during his legal proceedings demonstrates the public's morbid curiosity about extreme violence while also providing him with the attention and notoriety that had been among his psychological motivations for criminal activity. The victim impact statements delivered during Richard's legal proceedings provided his survivors with opportunities for psychological closure while also demonstrating to the court and public the lasting damage caused by his random acts of extreme violence. Richard's sentencing to death represented both legal justice and community closure. though the lengthy appeals process would deny final resolution to victims and their families while allowing Richard to continue receiving the attention he craved through media coverage. The psychological analysis of Richard's capture reveals how even the most chaotic and unpredictable criminals eventually create vulnerabilities that can be exploited by systematic law enforcement and community cooperation when adequate resources and coordination are applied. Richard's post-capture behavior in prison demonstrates his adaptation to a controlled environment while maintaining his grandiose beliefs and antisocial tendencies, showing how institutional constraints can limit but not eliminate the psychological factors that drove his criminal behavior. The investigative lessons learned from Richard's capture continue to influence law enforcement procedures for managing high-profile cases, coordinating multi-jurisdictional efforts, and utilizing community resources in apprehending dangerous criminals who threaten public safety. Richard's capture psychology demonstrates that even criminals who operate through pure randomness and chaos eventually become predictable through their basic human needs and psychological limitations, creating opportunities for law enforcement intervention and community action. The community healing process that began with Richard's capture involved both celebration of his apprehension and the difficult work of processing the trauma and fear that his crimes had created throughout Southern California's diverse communities. Richard's exposure through media coverage following his capture served multiple psychological functions, including community catharsis, law enforcement validation, and demonstration that even the most terrifying criminals could be brought to justice through persistent effort and community cooperation. The psychological legacy of Richard's capture includes lasting changes to community safety awareness, law enforcement coordination procedures, and public understanding of the importance of citizen vigilance and cooperation in maintaining public safety against extreme criminal threats. Richard Ramirez's capture represents the ultimate failure of chaotic criminal methodology when confronted with systematic law enforcement and aroused community determination, proving that even the most unpredictable and terrifying criminals are ultimately vulnerable to basic investigative techniques and collective action. The circumstances of Richard's apprehension demonstrate that criminal psychology, no matter how sophisticated or chaotic, cannot ultimately overcome the combined resources of coordinated law enforcement and determined community action when provided with adequate tools and information. His capture and exposure mark the end of one of criminal history's most terrifying chapters, while providing crucial lessons about criminal behavior, investigative methodology, and the importance of community cooperation in maintaining public safety against those who would terrorize innocent citizens through random violence. The legal proceedings against Richard Ramirez represented one of criminal justice's most complex challenges, involving a defendant whose psychological pathology, grandiose delusions, and deliberate disruptive behavior transformed the courtroom into another arena for his need to terrorize and control. His trial became a psychological battlefield where the justice system struggled to maintain order while confronting pure evil. Richard's initial court appearances immediately established the psychological dynamics that would characterize his entire legal process, as he used every opportunity to display satanic symbols, intimidate witnesses, and demonstrate his complete contempt for legal authority and social conventions. The psychological assessment challenges created by Richard's case were unprecedented, as mental health professionals struggled to evaluate a defendant whose drug-damaged brain, supernatural beliefs, and calculated manipulation made accurate diagnosis and competency determination extremely difficult. Richard's competency to stand trial became a central legal issue, as his bizarre behavior and occult beliefs raised questions about his ability to understand proceedings and assist in his defense, while his obvious intelligence and strategic thinking suggested calculated manipulation rather than genuine mental incapacity. The defense strategy psychology involved the impossible task of representing a client who actively undermined his own legal interests while demanding to maintain control over his presentation and refusing to accept responsibility or show remorse for his crimes. Richard's courtroom behavior throughout his trial demonstrates his continued need for attention and dominance even in captivity, as he transformed legal proceedings into performance opportunities where he could maintain his terrorizing presence and occult identity. The victim testimony psychology during Richard's trial was particularly challenging, as survivors had to relive their traumatic experiences while facing their attacker in a controlled setting where his ability to harm them was limited but his psychological intimidation continued. Richard's psychological impact on court personnel was significant and unprecedented, as judges, attorneys, and staff had to manage their own fear and revulsion while maintaining professional objectivity in the face of such calculated evil and disruptive behavior. The jury selection psychology for Richard's case involved identifying citizens who could fairly evaluate evidence while maintaining emotional stability when confronted with graphic testimony about extreme violence and the intimidating presence of an unrepentant killer. Richard's media manipulation during his trial demonstrates his sophisticated understanding of public attention and his ability to use legal proceedings as a platform for spreading his satanic message while maintaining the notoriety and fear that provided him with psychological satisfaction. The prosecution strategy psychology involved presenting overwhelming evidence of Richard's crimes while managing the emotional impact on jurors and maintaining focus on legal facts rather than allowing the proceedings to become consumed by his disruptive behavior and occult theatrics. Richard's relationship with his defense attorneys was characterized by conflict and manipulation, as he demanded control over his representation while simultaneously undermining their efforts to provide adequate legal defense, creating ethical and strategic dilemmas for counsel. The penalty phase psychology of Richard's trial involved the prosecution's presentation of aggravating factors that demonstrated the extreme cruelty and depravity of his crimes, while the defense struggled to present mitigating evidence about his troubled background without appearing to excuse his actions. Richard's elocution during sentencing provided him with a final opportunity to terrorize and intimidate, as he used his statement to express no remorse while reaffirming his satanic beliefs and contempt for his victims, the legal system, and society in general. The psychological impact of Richard's death sentence on both the community and the legal system was complex, providing a sense of justice and closure while also beginning a lengthy appeals process that would deny final resolution for decades. Richard's appeals psychology demonstrates his continued manipulation of the legal system to maintain attention and delay execution while providing him with ongoing opportunities to present himself as a victim of legal persecution rather than acknowledging his status as a convicted killer. The legal precedent implications of Richard's case include important developments in competency evaluation, courtroom security procedures, and victim rights protections that continue to influence criminal justice practices in high-profile cases involving dangerous defendants. Richard's prison behavior during his legal proceedings reveals his adaptation to institutional constraints while maintaining his grandiose self-image and antisocial tendencies, demonstrating how incarceration can limit, but not eliminate, dangerous psychological characteristics. The victim impact statement, psychology during Richard's sentencing provided survivors and families with opportunities to confront their attacker while also allowing the court to understand the lasting psychological damage caused by his crimes and their continuing impact on the community. Richard's psychological evaluation results revealed the complex interaction between his substance abuse history, head injuries, family dysfunction, and supernatural beliefs that created his criminal pathology. while also confirming his legal responsibility for his actions. The legal system's struggle with Richard's case demonstrates the challenges of maintaining justice procedures when confronting defendants whose psychological makeup and deliberate disruption threaten the orderly administration of justice and the safety of all participants. Richard's continued correspondence and media interaction during his incarceration shows his ongoing need for attention and recognition, while also revealing his complete lack of genuine remorse or insight into the impact of his crimes on victims and society. The appellate process psychology involves Richard's attempts to overturn his conviction and death sentence through claims of legal error, ineffective counsel, and mental health issues, while maintaining his public profile through continued media attention and correspondence. Richard's influence on legal procedures includes lasting changes to courtroom security protocols, defendant restraint policies, and victim protection measures that were developed in response to his disruptive and intimidating behavior during proceedings. The psychological impact of Richard's case on the broader legal community includes enhanced awareness of the challenges posed by defendants with severe personality disorders and supernatural belief systems that can undermine traditional legal processes and threaten participant safety. Richard's legal legacy includes important developments in criminal justice procedures, from managing high-profile cases involving dangerous defendants who use legal proceedings as platforms for continued psychological terrorism and public attention-seeking behavior. The constitutional issues raised by Richard's case involve balancing defendants' rights to due process and legal representation with the need to maintain courtroom order and protect victims, witnesses, and court personnel from intimidation and psychological harm. Richard's psychological impact on the justice system extends beyond his individual case to influence training programs, security procedures, and mental health resources available to court personnel dealing with extreme criminal cases and disturbed defendants. The sentencing psychology in Richard's case reflects society's struggle to respond appropriately to crimes that exceed normal understanding of human behavior while maintaining legal principles of proportionality and constitutional protections even for the most heinous offenders. Richard's continued legal challenges demonstrate his understanding that the appeals process provides him with ongoing opportunities for attention and delay, while also revealing the thoroughness of legal protections available even to defendants whose crimes shock the conscience of society. The victim advocacy developments that emerged from Richard's case include enhanced legal protections and support services for crime survivors who must participate in lengthy legal proceedings while facing continued intimidation from unrepentant offenders. Richard's psychological evaluation during legal proceedings revealed the limitations of traditional mental health assessment when applied to individuals whose pathology involves sophisticated manipulation, grandiose delusions, and complete absence of empathy or remorse. The legal system's response to Richard's case demonstrates both the strengths and limitations of criminal justice procedures when confronting extreme evil that challenges fundamental assumptions about human nature and the possibility of rehabilitation or redemption. Richard Ramirez's legal psychology represents one of criminal justice's most challenging cases, where the intersection of severe mental pathology, calculated manipulation, and extreme criminal behavior tested every aspect of legal procedures and constitutional protections. The legacy of Richard's legal proceedings continues to influence criminal justice practices, victim rights protections, and courtroom security measures, while also providing crucial insights into the challenges of maintaining legal order when confronting defendants whose psychological makeup threatens the foundations of civilized legal processes. His case demonstrates that even the most disturbed and dangerous criminals must be afforded due process protections, while also proving that the legal system can ultimately deliver justice even when confronted with evil that exceeds normal human comprehension, and challenges every assumption about criminal responsibility and punishment. The psychological legacy of Richard Ramirez extends far beyond his individual crimes to fundamentally challenge our understanding of criminal behavior, the nature of evil, and the complex factors that can transform damaged children into monsters whose random brutality defies all attempts at prediction or prevention. His case remains one of criminal psychology's most disturbing studies in pure chaos and unlimited violence. Richard's contribution to criminal psychology research has been primarily negative, demonstrating the limitations of traditional profiling and behavioral analysis when confronted with truly random criminal behavior driven by substance abuse, supernatural beliefs, and complete psychological deterioration rather than systematic patterns or recognizable motivations. The investigative lessons learned from Richard's case led to fundamental changes in multi-jurisdictional coordination, evidence-sharing systems, and community alert procedures that continue to influence law enforcement responses to serial crimes and random violence across multiple police territories. Richard's case demonstrates the profound impact of childhood trauma, family dysfunction, and exposure to violence in creating criminal pathology, while also showing how these factors can interact with substance abuse and ideological corruption to produce results that exceed all attempts at intervention or rehabilitation. The environmental factors that enabled Richard's crimes have influenced understanding of urban vulnerability and the importance of comprehensive approaches to community safety that address not just individual behaviors, but also the social conditions that can facilitate and enable criminal activity. Richard's victim selection methodology, or lack thereof, challenged every established principle of criminal profiling while demonstrating that some predators operate through pure randomness that makes them virtually impossible to predict, prevent, or profile using traditional law enforcement techniques. The technological limitations exposed by Richard's case drove advances in forensic science, communication systems, and database capabilities that continue to benefit law enforcement agencies dealing with complex criminal investigations requiring coordination across multiple jurisdictions and timeframes. Richard's psychological development patterns provide crucial insights into the interaction between neurological damage, substance abuse, and environmental factors in creating extreme antisocial behavior, while also demonstrating the limitations of mental health intervention when pathology reaches certain critical thresholds. The community impact of Richard's crimes resulted in lasting changes to residential security practices, neighborhood watch programs, and public safety awareness that continue to influence how communities approach crime prevention and personal protection decades after his capture. Richard's case illustrates the complex relationship between mental illness, criminal responsibility, and legal accountability, challenging traditional frameworks for understanding how psychological pathology should influence criminal justice responses to extreme violence and antisocial behavior. The media psychology surrounding Richard's crimes provides important lessons about the responsible reporting of serial violence while also demonstrating how criminal notoriety can become a motivating factor for individuals seeking recognition through extreme antisocial behavior and public terrorism. Richard's supernatural beliefs and occult practices offer insights into how ideological systems can provide psychological justification for unlimited violence while also creating belief structures that can override normal human inhibitions against harming others. The investigative coordination challenges highlighted by Richard's case led to lasting improvements in interagency communication, resource sharing, and joint task force procedures that continue to benefit law enforcement efforts to combat complex criminal cases requiring multiple jurisdictional cooperation. Richard's substance abuse patterns demonstrate the crucial role of drug addiction in removing psychological barriers to extreme violence while also showing how chemical dependency can accelerate criminal escalation and reduce the effectiveness of traditional intervention strategies. The victim impact legacy of Richard's crimes includes enhanced understanding of trauma psychology, improved support services for crime survivors, and better legal protections for victims participating in criminal proceedings against dangerous and unrepentant offenders. Richard's case highlights the importance of early intervention in cases of childhood trauma and behavioral disturbance, while also demonstrating the tragic consequences when warning signs are ignored or when adequate resources are not available for troubled youth. The forensic advances driven partly by Richard's case include improvements in fingerprint processing, evidence analysis, and crime scene investigation techniques that continue to benefit criminal investigations requiring rapid processing of complex physical evidence. Richard's prison behavior and continued correspondence reveal important insights into the long-term management of dangerous offenders, while also demonstrating how incarceration can limit, but not eliminate, the psychological factors that drive extreme antisocial behavior. The legal precedents established by Richard's case continue to influence criminal justice procedures for managing high-profile defendants, protecting victim rights, and maintaining courtroom security when dealing with individuals whose psychological makeup threatens orderly legal proceedings. Richard's case demonstrates the crucial importance of community vigilance and cooperation in maintaining public safety, while also showing how citizen action can be effective in apprehending dangerous criminals when provided with adequate information and support from law enforcement agencies. The psychological research opportunities provided by Richard's case have contributed to understanding of criminal development, substance abuse impacts, and the interaction between mental illness and criminal behavior, while also revealing the limitations of traditional therapeutic approaches. Richard's influence on popular culture and public perception of criminal behavior has been largely negative, contributing to sensationalized portrayals of serial killers while potentially inspiring copycat criminals seeking similar notoriety and recognition through extreme violence. The prevention strategies that have evolved partly in response to Richard's case emphasize the importance of addressing multiple risk factors simultaneously, including childhood trauma, substance abuse, social isolation, and exposure to violent ideology or criminal networks. Richard's case illustrates the complex challenges facing mental health professionals when attempting to assess and treat individuals with severe personality disorders, substance abuse histories, and grandiose delusions that can mask or complicate accurate diagnosis and treatment planning. The social policy implications of Richard's case include enhanced understanding of the connections between poverty, family dysfunction, substance abuse, and criminal behavior, while also demonstrating the importance of comprehensive approaches to crime prevention that address root causes. Richard's technological legacy includes advances in criminal database systems, communication networks, and forensic techniques that were developed partly in response to the challenges created by his case and continue to benefit law enforcement agencies worldwide. The educational value of Richard's case extends across multiple disciplines, including psychology, criminology, law enforcement, and social work, providing teaching opportunities about the complex factors that can contribute to extreme criminal behavior and the challenges of prevention and intervention. Richard's case demonstrates the ultimate limitations of purely chaotic criminal methodology, proving that even the most random and unpredictable criminals eventually create vulnerabilities that can be exploited by systematic law enforcement and community cooperation. The therapeutic implications of Richard's case have influenced treatment approaches for individuals with antisocial personality disorders, substance abuse problems, and supernatural belief systems, while also highlighting the limitations of traditional therapeutic interventions with severely disturbed offenders. Richard's continuing influence on criminal justice education includes his case being studied as an example of investigative challenges, legal complexities, and the importance of multidisciplinary approaches to understanding and responding to extreme criminal behavior. The societal impact of Richard's crimes extends beyond their immediate damage to include lasting changes in how communities understand personal safety, criminal behavior, and the importance of collective action in maintaining public security against those who would terrorize innocent citizens. Richard's psychological legacy serves as a cautionary tale about the potential for human evil while also demonstrating the importance of early intervention, comprehensive prevention strategies, and coordinated community responses to criminal behavior that threatens public safety. The lessons learned from Richard Ramirez's case continue to influence understanding of criminal psychology, investigative methodology, and community safety practices, while also providing crucial insights into the complex factors that can transform damaged individuals into monsters whose actions exceed normal human comprehension. Richard's case ultimately demonstrates both the horrifying potential for human evil and the resilience of communities and justice systems that can overcome even the most terrifying criminal threats through persistent effort, coordinated action, and unwavering commitment to protecting innocent citizens from those who would harm them. The legacy of the Night Stalker serves as both warning and inspiration, warning about the devastating consequences when psychological damage, substance abuse, and ideological corruption combine to create monsters, while also inspiring confidence that even the most terrifying criminals can ultimately be brought to justice through community cooperation and systematic law enforcement.